In 1993, economists made a promise. Pass NAFTA, they said, embrace free trade, lower the barriers. What follows will be prosperity for all, cheaper goods, more jobs, rising wages, everyone wins. Every serious economist agreed, the models were clear, the theory was settled, free trade was good, only ignorant protectionists thought otherwise. 30 years later, let's check the results. The Rust Belt is a graveyard. 5 million manufacturing jobs disappeared. Entire communities hollowed out. Deaths of despair, suicides, and overdoses exploded in regions that lost factories. The industrial heartland became an opioid disaster zone. Meanwhile, corporate profits hit record highs. The stock market boomed. The top 10% captured almost all income gains. CEO compensation rose from 30 times worker pay to over 300 times. The economists weren't wrong about everything. Trade did increase. Goods did get cheaper. GDP did grow. They were just wrong about who would benefit. Today, I'm going to show you what free trade actually did. Not the theory, the data, the factory closures, the wage stagnation, the wealth transfer from workers to shareholders that happened in plain sight while economists insisted everyone was winning. This is the deal that killed the middle class, and the people who made it still won't admit what they did. 1. The promise. Let's remember what we were told. Free trade theory is elegant. Countries should specialize in what they do best. America makes movies and software. China makes electronics and clothes. Trade lets each country focus on its comparative advantage. Total output increases. Everyone's better off. Yes, some workers might be displaced, but they'll find new jobs in growing sectors. The gains from trade are large enough that winners can compensate losers. With proper adjustment assistance, everyone benefits. This was the consensus. It wasn't controversial. Economists left, right, and center agreed. Greg Mankiw agreed with Paul Krugman, agreed with every textbook. The political establishment agreed too. Bill Clinton championed NAFTA. George Bush championed China's WTO entry. Obama championed the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The policy was bipartisan because the economics was settled. Opponents were dismissed as ignorant, as protectionists who didn't understand economics, as xenophobes afraid of foreigners. Their concerns were unsophisticated. And then reality happened. 2. The China shock. The most important economic research of the past decade is something called the China shock literature. Economists David Otter, David Dorn, and Gordon Hanson asked a simple question: what actually happened to American communities exposed to Chinese import competition after China joined the WTO in 2001? Their findings demolished the consensus. Communities that faced more Chinese competition saw dramatic, persistent job losses, not temporary displacement followed by recovery, permanent destruction. Manufacturing employment in these areas collapsed, but the workers didn't smoothly transition to new industries. They dropped out of the labor force, they went on disability, they died. The numbers are staggering. Between 2000 and 2010, America lost 5.5 million manufacturing jobs. The economists estimate that about 2 to 2.4 million of these were directly caused by Chinese import competition. Not automation, not technology, trade. Wages fell in affected areas. Employment rates fell. Labor force participation fell. Government transfer payments, disability and welfare rose to partially fill the gap. The adjustment that was supposed to happen, it didn't. Workers didn't move to new industries. They didn't retrain for better jobs. They just lost. 3. The geography of pain. The damage wasn't random, it was concentrated. Pull up a map of manufacturing job losses. Now overlay a map of the opioid epidemic. Now overlay a map of deaths of despair, the term economists use for suicides, overdoses, and alcohol-related deaths. The maps match. Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Indiana, West Virginia. These states lost manufacturing and then lost their people to addiction and suicide. This correlation isn't coincidence. Research has directly linked trade-related job losses to increased mortality. A study found that for every 1,000 people exposed to significant import competition, there were additional deaths from suicide, drug overdoses, and alcohol-related causes. Free trade didn't just cost jobs, it cost lives. The communities that built America, the factory towns that won World War II and created the middle class, were sacrificed. Their residents weren't retrained, they were discarded. And the economists who designed this policy, they were fine. They live in cities that benefited from trade. They shop at Walmart and enjoy cheap Chinese goods. The adjustment costs were borne by someone else. 4. NAFTA's real legacy. Before China, there was Mexico. NAFTA passed in 1994 over fierce opposition. Ross Perot warned of a giant sucking sound as jobs went south. Economists mocked him. The models said NAFTA would create jobs. What happened? The Congressional Research Service, hardly a radical source, summarized it. NAFTA had minimal effects on overall employment. The gains and losses roughly balanced. But roughly balanced hides the distribution. The gains went to shareholders and consumers. The losses went to workers, specifically manufacturing workers. Between 1994 and 2020, the U.S. lost roughly 850,000 jobs due to NAFTA, according to Economic Policy Institute estimates. These weren't random jobs. They were good jobs, union jobs, jobs with benefits and pensions. The jobs that replaced them? Often service sector, lower pay, no union, no pension, different communities. A worker in Michigan who lost a $25-hour auto parts job didn't get a $25-hour job in Phoenix. They got a $15-hour job at Walmart if they were lucky, or they got nothing. NAFTA didn't destroy the economy. It transferred wealth, from workers to shareholders, from the Rust Belt to the coasts, from the middle class to the upper class. 5. Where the money went. If workers lost, who won? Corporations, shareholders, the ownership class. The logic is straightforward. When you can produce goods in Mexico or China at a fraction of US labor costs, profits rise. Those profits flow to shareholders. Look at the data. Corporate profits as a share of GDP rose from around 6% in the early 1990 seconds to over 10% by the 2010 seconds. That's hundreds of billions of dollars annually shifted from labor to capital. The stock market reflects this. The S&P 500 rose roughly 800% from 1993 to 2023. The top 10% of Americans own over 80% of stocks. They captured this appreciation. Meanwhile, median worker compensation stagnated. Real wages for non-supervisory workers barely budged for decades. Productivity rose 60%, wages rose 15%, the gap went to capital. This wasn't supposed to happen. The theory said trade gains would be shared. In practice, the gains flowed upward. Why? Because workers lost bargaining power. When your employer can credibly threaten to move production to China, you accept whatever wage they offer. The mere existence of the foreign option suppresses domestic wages even in industries that don't actually offshore. Free trade didn't just move jobs, it weakened every worker's negotiating position. 6. The consumer shell game. Trade defenders have a response. What about consumer prices? Yes, manufacturing workers lost jobs, but everyone got cheaper goods. That TV that cost $500 now costs $200. Those clothes, those electronics, those household items, all cheaper because of trade. Doesn't this benefit workers too? Don't cheap goods offset lost wages? Let's do the math. The average American household saves perhaps $10,000 per year from lower prices due to trade by the most generous estimates. More conservative estimates put it at $2,000, $5,000. But the median household lost far more than that in wage stagnation. If wages had kept pace with productivity, median household income would be $20,000, $30,000 higher annually. Cheap TVs don't compensate for that. And the distribution matters again. A cheap TV benefits everyone equally, but wage losses concentrate on specific workers. The laid-off factory worker gets cheap Chinese goods and no income. That's not a trade-off. That's devastation with a small consolation prize. The consumer benefits argument also ignores what we lost. We lost communities, we lost stable careers, we lost the social fabric of manufacturing towns. We lost the working class path to middle class life. Can you put a price on that? Can cheap electronics compensate for your town dying? 7. The promised adjustment. The Economists had an answer for job losses: adjustment assistance. Yes, some workers would be displaced, but the government would help them. Training programs, relocation assistance, extended unemployment benefits. The workers would transition to new industries. The adjustment assistance never worked. Trade adjustment assistance (TAA) programs existed. They were underfunded, poorly designed, and largely ineffective. Studies found that workers in TAA programs had only marginally better outcomes than those who didn't participate. Why? Because the problem wasn't skill mismatch, It was geographic and structural. A 50-year-old factory worker in Ohio can't easily become a software engineer in San Francisco. They have a house they can't sell because their whole town is depressed. They have family. They have roots. Just move and retrain isn't a serious policy. It's an abstraction. And the new jobs often weren't there. The economy created jobs, but not in the places that lost them. The growth was in cities, in services, in industries that required different skills and different locations. The adjustment was supposed to be temporary friction. Instead, it was permanent loss. A generation of workers never recovered. They just aged into poverty, disability, and death. 8. What economists got wrong. Let's be specific about the professional failure. Economists predicted that trade with China would look like trade with Canada or Europe. Developed countries trading with each other, each specializing in different high-skill industries. They didn't predict the scale of manufacturing collapse. They didn't predict the permanence of job losses. They didn't predict the social devastation. Why were they wrong? They underestimated the labor cost gap. Trading with China wasn't like trading with Germany. Chinese wages were a small fraction of American wages. The arbitrage opportunity was enormous. Companies didn't just relocate some production. They relocated everything possible. They overestimated adjustment speed. The models assumed workers would quickly reallocate to new industries. But labor markets don't work that fast. People don't move easily. Skills don't transfer instantly. The adjustment that was supposed to take months took decades, if it happened at all. They ignored geography. Economics tends to ignore place. Workers are assumed to be mobile factors of production. But people live in communities. They have homes and families and connections. When an industry leaves, the community doesn't just disperse, it suffers. They assumed compensation would happen. The theory says trade creates enough surplus to compensate losers. But compensation requires political action. It requires taxes on winners and transfers to losers. In practice, winners lobby against compensation. Losers don't get compensated. They trusted their models too much. Economists had theoretical models showing trade was beneficial. They had studies of previous trade agreements showing modest effects. They extrapolated to a situation, massive trade with a low-wage giant, that was fundamentally different. The models were elegant, reality was messier. 9. The political reckoning. For decades, trade skeptics were dismissed. They were told they didn't understand economics. They were called nativists and protectionists. Then came 2016. Donald Trump won the presidency by promising to tear up trade deals and bring back manufacturing jobs. He won Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ohio, the states most devastated by deindustrialization. Bernie Sanders nearly won the Democratic nomination with similar trade skepticism. The political establishment was stunned. How could voters reject what every expert said was good for them? Because the experts were wrong. Voters in Youngstown and Flint knew something economists in Cambridge and Palo Alto didn't. Free trade had destroyed their communities, and no one in power cared. This wasn't ignorance, it was experience. The factory workers knew more about the effects of trade than the economists with their models. The 2016 election was many things, but partly it was a referendum on free trade, and free trade lost. 10. What we actually learned. Let me be clear about what the data shows and doesn't show. Trade is not inherently bad. Trade between similar economies, US with Canada or Europe, has more balanced effects. The problems come with massive wage disparities and rapid, large-scale shifts. China was different. The China shock was unique in scale. Nothing in post-war trade experience predicted what would happen when a billion low-wage workers suddenly joined the global trading system. Adjustment failed. The promise that displaced workers would transition to new industries was not fulfilled. Adjustment assistance was underfunded and ineffective. The gains were captured by capital. Trade increased total output, but the distribution of that output shifted dramatically toward owners and away from workers. Communities matter. Economics that ignores geography misses the real human costs. Displaced workers don't just lose jobs, they lose communities, identity, and meaning. Economists were overconfident. The consensus was wrong. Not completely wrong, trade did increase efficiency and lower prices, but catastrophically wrong about the distribution of costs and benefits. 11. What should have happened? What would responsible trade policy have looked like? Slower integration. China's WTO entry could have been phased in over decades rather than years. Gradual tariff reductions would have allowed more adjustment time. Enforceable labor standards. Trade agreements could have required minimum labor standards in partner countries. This would have reduced the wage arbitrage that made offshoring so attractive. Serious adjustment programs. Real investment in affected communities, not token job training but economic development, infrastructure, education, support for communities, not just individuals. Tax and transfer. Explicit mechanisms to tax winners from trade and transfer to losers. The surplus existed, it just wasn't shared. Industrial policy. Strategic investment in industries America wanted to keep. Not letting the market decide everything when the market was distorted by foreign subsidies and currency manipulation. None of this happened. Free trade was treated as an unqualified good. Concerns were dismissed, the winners won and the losers lost, and the economists moved on to their next conference. 12. Where we are now. The consensus has finally shifted. Barely, belatedly, insufficiently. Economists now acknowledge the China shock. They acknowledge that adjustment was harder than predicted. They acknowledge that distribution matters. But the damage is done. The factories aren't coming back. The skills aren't there. The supply chains have been built in Asia. Even with tariffs, reshoring is slow and partial. The communities aren't coming back. The young people left. The remaining population is older, poorer, sicker. You can't rebuild what took generations to create. The trust isn't coming back. Working class voters saw the bipartisan establishment sacrifice them for GDP numbers. They're not forgetting. Free trade was an experiment. The hypothesis was that everyone would benefit. The experiment ran for 30 years. The results are in. The hypothesis was wrong. Conclusion. The reckoning. I want to be clear about what I'm saying. I'm not saying trade is always bad. I'm not saying autarky is better. I'm not saying we should wall off the economy. I'm saying we were lied to. Maybe not deliberately. Maybe the economists believed their models. But the promise was made. Free trade benefits everyone. The promise was broken. Millions of workers lost their livelihoods. Thousands of communities were destroyed. The middle class was hollowed out. An epidemic of despair killed hundreds of thousands. And the people who made these decisions, who insisted the models were right, who dismissed concerns as ignorant, who collected their consulting fees and conference invitations while Youngstown died, they never apologized. They never admitted error. They just moved on. The data is clear. Free trade as implemented made America's working class poorer. It transferred wealth from labor to capital. It devastated communities. It cost lives. That's not opinion. That's the research. Conducted by mainstream economists, published in top journals, no longer controversial. The deal killed us. Now we're living with the consequences. If this analysis showed you something the history books won't tell you, hit that subscribe button. Because understanding how we got here is the first step to not making the same mistake again. See you in the comments, and remember, when experts tell you a policy benefits everyone, ask who's counting and who's being counted.